Hello and welcome. My name is Paul Farber. I'm director and co-founder of Monument Lab, and on behalf of our team, of our board of advisors, of our circle of collaborators, we welcome you to the first Regeneration Roundtable on the theme of Reassess. This is the first in a series of roundtables with artists, educators, storytellers, and organizers from around the country, all centered around the question of what stories belong in public. Regeneration is a nationwide participatory public art and history project organized by Monument Lab. And the project is aiming to elevate people shaping the next generation of monuments, reckoning with and reimagining public memory. Each team around the country is pursuing a commemorative campaign rooted in the living history of their neighborhood, city, or region. And this project is supported by the Mellon Foundation's Monuments Project. Tonight, we have our first in our series. We are thrilled to have our host, Dr. Matt Jordan Miller Kenyatta, with us throughout the run of this series, and we'll hear from him in a moment. I want to encourage all of you to keep in touch with us at monument_lab on social media and joining our mailing list so you can make sure to get links to the next set of conversations throughout this summer. The group tonight is a special brain trust of Monument Lab collaborators and Regeneration participants. It includes Miss Lois Conley, who is the team lead from Regeneration St. Louis project, the Black HerStory initiative. And she is also an incredibly well-known figure in St. Louis and beyond of the Griot Museum of Black History. We are also joined by Andrea Steves, Museum of Capitalism, and an advisor for Regeneration, and collaborators Tanya S. Autry and Mike Murawski of Museums Are Not Neutral, among many other projects, are here. And just a special shout out to the work of Tanya and Mike. We've collaborated with them on a project that's just coming out next week. You'll get a sneak peek tonight. It is a Monument Lab field trip focused on museums, and we were really excited to work with them and Super Nature Adventures. We'll get a sneak peek of that tonight. And of course, we are hosted by the wonderful Dr. Matt Jordan Miller Kenyatta, who is also Director of Justice and Belonging at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design. And with that, I want to pass it over to Dr. Matt for the program. I'm excited for this opportunity to engage with you and to have you guide us through and give a longer introduction, but let the roundtable begin.
All right, sounds good, Paul, and welcome everyone. I'm really grateful to have been invited to be part of this conversation and really just to see the Monument Lab ecosystem in action. I think this is a really important group, a really important time to be having these conversations. And I'm honored that, Paul and the team at Monument Lab, Sue and so many others thought of me to be the one that really in some ways gets to taste the gumbo of all these amazing different ideas and projects and brilliance that they've curated over the years and have culminated in what they're now calling the Regeneration Project. So this is the first of a series of conversations. And I'm grateful for you all, of course, everyone that's here now. You could have been anywhere on an afternoon or an evening or early morning for some of our panelists, actually. But you chose this, and we're really grateful for your presence. Presence is really key to what Monument Lab does and what so many of us that do as well. Just a little bit of background about me. I'm a geographer, a storyteller, and urban designer. I focus a lot on placemaking and placekeeping. And presence is really what we're after a lot of times. And one thing that Paul often says that I would just quote here is that monuments are statements of power and presence in public. And so we are gathered today on a digital platform. It's our form of being public today. And so your presence is key to that. It's really key to that. So thank you all so much. This is a special time in the evolution of Monument Lab. and then this project. Like I said, we're kicking it off, but it's just on the heels of some really big moments. The anniversary of Monument Lab, last month, or actually a few months ago, the Monument Audit, which I would encourage everyone to check out. It's a personal favorite of mine, showing really the context that we're all operating in and against. So with that being said, I want to give you all a sense of who I have the honor of talking with today and sort of creating a conversation with. So I'm going to start off with, in alphabetical order, Ms. Lois Conley, as the founder and executive director of the Griot Museum of Black History. If you don't know, her research interests include African American history with a focus on the Underground Railroad and westward expansion. She's been a consultant to the National Park Service, the Missouri Humanities Council, and the Royal Tropical Museum in Amsterdam. Tanya Autry, aka Art Stuff Matters, which I love, as a cultural worker, curator, and educator committed to liberatory practice. She's developed exhibitions and programming from places such as Yale University Art Gallery, the MoCA Cleveland, Art Space New Haven, creating freedom projects such as the Social Justice and Museums Resource List, the Art of Black Descent. Of course, Museums is Not Neutral, which she has a partner here with her today from that project. And her dissertation from in art history at the University of Delaware was titled The Crossroads of Commemoration, Lynching Landscapes in America, that examines the interplay of race, representation, memory, and public space. Love that. Mike Murawski is a consultant and educator, the author of Museums as Agents of Change, A Guide to Becoming a Change Maker, which debuted last year, 2021. As the author of the Substack publication Agents of Change, and the co-producer with Tanya here of Museums That Are Not Neutral. It's a global advocacy campaign calling for transformation across museums, which they will, I no doubt, draw from in our conversation today. And also has his MA and PhD in education from American University in Washington, D.C. Lastly, here we have Andrea Steves, who is an artist, curator, researcher, and organizer based between Vienna, which is where they're based now, and Austria and New York in the US, and whose recent projects is for capitalism, climate change, public history, museums, and monuments. All right, so with all of those honorifics on the table, I hope you all feel confident and trust in this is going to be a great conversation of the minds, but not just really from a place of expertise, but also really hopefully some insight and vulnerability as to what it's really like to do the work that you do in the world. So thank you all so much for showing up for this conversation, and to Monument Lab for bringing these folks together. All right, so we got the honorifics out the way. Now we're kind of going to transition into some questions, and I wanted to sort of ask you all to introduce yourself beyond the sort of veneer, beyond the surface. Really tell us, for people who are coming into this work of public memory and of monuments, it really is I mean, even for me as a first generation college grad, I didn't know that this was a field for a long time in my journey in design and planning. So I'm personally interested in this question of how you began your projects and sort of, how did you transition into this sort of formal memory keeping interrogation work that you all do? And I promised everyone that we would go in alphabetical order. So Ms. Lois Conley, if you want to kick us off, that would be awesome. What's your story?
Oh, what's my story? It's interesting. I think I'm probably always the oldest person on the panel all the time. So my story is pretty big.
That's all right.
But it's interesting. I guess I'll start maybe with the start of the Griot Museum. I didn't come to, I'm like you, I didn't come to it thinking that when I grew up, I wanted to be a museum professional. That was probably the farthest thing from my mind.
Right.
But I just kind of believe though that, our life, along our path, we get prepared for things that we don't know we're being prepared for. And then when it happens, you just kind of float into it, you fall into it. And I think that's what happened with the Griot. All my life, I've been around people who had a keen sense of history and Black history, not necessarily always formal, but just always kind of passing on a tidbit here and there, always making sure you knew who some of the ancestors were. If you didn't know it in great detail, their names were sort of always mentioned. And being fortunate in high school, have counselors and teachers who made sure you got to know that, although it wasn't part of the formal education. I grew up in a community called Mill Creek here in St. Louis, and it's one of those that failed because of urban renewal. And actually, they put a highway and used the space to build a highway, basically. And in that community, we were really, really community oriented, really family oriented, really about passing on and keeping and preserving. And that never left me, no matter what I did in any pursuit, any job, I always realized how important it was to have that connectedness. So I just was sort of busily, without even knowing that I was busily preparing myself to work in a museum, I was always collecting stories and objects and things. And one day before I knew it, I was saying like, somebody really ought to build a museum in St. Louis. And somebody was thinking about it for 4 or 5 different times and never happened. And suddenly I found myself going around speaking about museums and history. And suddenly I was finally founding a museum. With no money, no connections, no expertise, nothing, except the realization that we had stories that were important, that somebody needed to tell. And how they got told wasn't even important, but somebody needed to tell them. And I knew a few of them, and I thought I could learn a few more. And so I started the museum, basically. And I've been doing that now. We're open now. As a matter of fact, speaking of milestones, this is our 25th anniversary this year.
Oh, yay.
So we've been doing it for 25 years now, trying to make sure those stories get told. And, like probably many of you, being pretty conscious about how they have historically been told or not told, if you will. And this issue of monuments for me became probably more clear as we started to talk about, certainly the lynching, the lynching museum in Alabama, but certainly probably a lot earlier than that, when there became a real interest in the city in redeveloping the Mill Creek, not redeveloping it for housing and things like that, but putting memory-making monuments in that neighborhood. And we had already begun to do some historical oral history interviews with some folks from those neighborhoods. And the museum is located in a neighborhood, again, where because of community development, there is a huge displacement of residents just around the corner from where the museum sits. And we were part of that community initiative to make sure those stories got told. And there was some kind of memory making piece throughout the neighborhood. And hopefully that's still going to happen. We've been promised that it is. It's a big government agency. But it just seemed like there were bits and pieces of things that needed to have a memory somewhere made for it, so that those stories and those people who were important, to whom those stories were important, did get overlooked. That's kind of how I came into this whole business of memory making. Long story.
That's beautiful. And I heard you loud and clear when you said, maybe you didn't feel like you had expertise, but I always tell people, your lived experience and your lived journey is longitudinal data. That is the data that you embody. And it's so beautiful to hear how you recognize that was valuable and needed an institution around it. So hats off, roses to all of that. How about you, LaTanya, and Mike, you can also jump in on this too. How did you all get started with the projects you're currently involved with, but really also your journeys into this type of work?
Yeah, I love what you just said. I was writing that down. Lived experience is longitudinal. What was it?
Data.
I'm writing that down because I like these expressions. Thank you. But that was a great story. I love hearing about Miss Lois's journey and development of a museum. I mean, for me, I think it's always hard to know like where to start, but I guess I'll think about as a student coming into art history, I had a strong interest in public memory kind of projects for a long time. And it also felt as going into studying these things formally, because I went that route, the formal route. And I was thinking about museums, but I also was actually studying museums really as a thing in itself, as a cultural product, like how somebody might study, photography or painting or whatever, the history of painting. I would study like the museum as a thing. And I felt really conflicted about it because I did grow up going to museums and things like that. Which is sometimes unusual for people who actually work in museums. A lot of people don't. I did grow up going, but I also had these mixed feelings. Like I liked them, but I also found a lot of times I thought they were, really exclusionary kind of spaces. They didn't have anything to do with like any of my history or people like me. And so I had this real conflicted kind of thing going on. And I felt like pretty much with the training I got also just kind of ignored the fact that most people's histories are not included in those institutions, and the institutions often, not all, but often are pretty racist and very elitist, have a lot of class discrimination that they do and other things. But my training didn't really talk about that stuff. And I found that when I was starting, I was trying to negotiate these, try to live those fractures and just kind of live that, where over in this space, I acknowledge all of these histories that are ignored. But when I go to class and when I'm in these museums, I'm just, because everybody else isn't going to talk about it, I guess I'm not going to talk about it either. It's only me all the time who's bringing this stuff up. So I was trying to live this crazy fractured kind of existence that's actually prominent for many of us. But I found that really the dissertation work that I do in studying lynching, I just was like, I can't keep this up. There's no way I can actually talk about lynching history in any way that's actually ethical and honest, and keep trying to live these lies that institutions really compel people to go along with. And I would say especially like Black people or people who kind of living almost like in a colonized, subjugated kind of way, going to like white institutions and stuff. Because if you bring it up, it's like, you're the problem, blah, blah, blah. And so you always have to be kind of fighting against that. There is no way that anybody could honestly tell the story of lynching history in the United States without going into all of that. So it's like, okay, I'm just gonna have to go there. And at the same time, I was working at a lot of these hegemonic whiteness kind of institutions that were keeping up all kind of farces going on where they would act like they're neutral. They kept saying that stuff. And I was like, okay, come on. Like, you need to stop saying that. Like, just be proud that whatever you are, that, just lean into it, that, that you do all this exclusionary stuff and be honest about it. Don't keep pretending that you're not doing it, because that was getting to be just offensive to me in some way, and as anybody who's got paying attention at all knows, of course, these places aren't neutral. Working in institutions that have, and I'm talking about places with these huge budgets, like $1 million, $1 billion endowments and so forth, in majority Black cities, and nobody Black or any folks of color have any positions of power in the institution, and they're going around talking about they're neutral. So I had kind of just got fed up with that, and I started speaking up against it. And so I just went public, and that just telling the basic truth that the museum is not neutral. For some reason, I know why, but for some reason, it is like, what? And a huge affront to people. And Mike was on his own journey, and we kind of came together with this frustration. And Mike, you can tell your saga.
Well, it's like bravery beget more bravery. That's really touched on a lot there. About the power of curation and so many other processes behind museums that lit a fire. So all right, Mike, what's your sort of half or other part of this story?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate what both of you have said already, Ms. Lois and LaTanya, because I think it's just exciting to have these conversations, because I think I started in museums not even knowing that museum jobs were a thing either. I didn't visit them much as a kid. And when I started my first museum education job, I was coming out of, really wanting to be a teacher in schools. and then just sort of, life put me in, being able to get a job in a museum, and I appreciated it and loved it. But I think I went in with like this strong interest in them being like really educational institutions, not just like saying they're educational institutions. And so there was a tension, I think, throughout, a lot of my like museum education career around like, why is it so hard for us to just open these spaces up to have, really powerful conversations and controversial conversations and meaningful things where we can really learn in a deeper way. And then kind of, as I, moved my way through several institutions, got really interested in, just partnering with, communities that had not been part of the power structures of museums, that had not, that had been excluded as Latanya sort of said, museums can be very exclusionary. And so I was really interested in like, why have we not reached out? Why have we not changed some of the processes for partnering with, other organizations, community groups, people that don't feel comfortable visiting museums, don't feel welcome, and spend, just so much time and effort. But it's just barrier after barrier with a lot of these institutions. And so, yeah, I think, kind of fast forwarding to, being, working in museums, and then like Latanya, what you said about, kind of being frustrated of institutions kind of being like, oh, like what we present to the public is just universal objective truth. We don't have any role in this. We're just showing, like I had museum directors that would just sort of say like, well, we just let the artists speak. We just let the objects speak for themselves, and sort of washing their hands of any of the decisions that go into all of that, like who they hire for leadership and curatorial positions, what objects are there, how they got there.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was awesome to, I think, social media they played a sort of large role in how Museums Are Not Neutral got started, because Latanya and I were sort of, frustrated and tweeting our frustrations. And so it was, Museums Are Not Neutral, and then, I think Latanya, you said, that should be a t-shirt. And I said, yeah, it should be a t-shirt. Let's make it happen. And we thought, like 6 people would buy a t-shirt, and then a week later it would be over with. And that was what now, almost 6 years.
Wow.
5 years ago, I think it was. Yeah. And like, I don't know how many thousands of, people have engaged with it. It's just been really great to it's been great to go visit a museum and see someone completely unrelated to me, me or anyone that I know, like wearing it. But just had to build a community to create more awareness around a lot of these ideas. So yeah, so it's just been important to me to sort of, a lot of the work that I've done and trying to just get, change happening within these institutions. And this has been a really awesome one to collaborate with Latanya on.
Oh, that's beautiful. And I think, as humanists here, we can all appreciate the power of words. And if nothing else, the phrase you came up with, we've seen Black Lives Matter started as a phrase too, right? And so words are powerful, and framing is really, really important. So thank you all for framing a really important part of the culture of museums. And so before we get too deep into that, Andrea, how about you? What's your journey into the work that you're doing, and how did you sort of transition into it?
Sure. And I'll mostly maybe focus on talking about Museum of Capitalism, but I've been working on a whole bunch of other projects, and there's so many. It's really great to be in this conversation. And also it's been super great to participate within the Regen Advisory Board and get to see these projects. I already have like an entire page of notes. We could just converse over each other's bios, I think, for like 2 hours. So, I mean, for me, I think a lot of what was said already really resonated with me. Maybe something that I add that was a little different is that I feel like a lot of my interest in public history kind of came out of working within social movements and as an organizer, and really sort of thinking about the struggles that we are in, seemingly like more and more every day, economic, political, war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And how a lot of times within organizing, within sort of any social movement, we have this sort of intergenerational exchange, and you kind of find yourself in this position where you're seeking change that you won't necessarily see in your lifetime. But you're also kind of consistently learning from the past and looking back at sort of strategies and tactics and previous fights and wins and losses. And the Museum of Capitalism kind of came out of this place. Actually, Latanya, something that you said about kind of going to museums, but having all of these questions. So like feeling like there's something very useful about this form of the museum in that it gives us some sort of space and distance to observe things around us. But then there's sort of a lot that is missing and you're really only ever seeing one very particular side of the story. So the Museum of Capitalism, I mean, it also kind of operated in the same way initially as perhaps a slogan on a t-shirt, that just the words Museum of Capitalism do all this work, where all of a sudden we're trying to think from a perspective where capitalism is over, right? It's like the time where we're going to musealize it. And we sort of formed the project, myself and my collaborator, which then expanded to hundreds of artists, community groups, other curators. We've worked with educational institutions. We've worked with actual museums, other speculative museums, all sorts of institutions over the run of the institution. But I think the idea was that as many of us are living through capitalism and experiencing this kind of inbuilt violence in many ways, that we're interested in thinking through these present struggles, economic and political and climate, all of the isms that we're sort of fighting against as struggles against capitalism. And the idea is that the museum works by kind of putting capitalism in a museum, which is something that artists do really do this sort of work of defamiliarization really well. So basically by putting capitalism in the museum, it helps us to sort of step back and perhaps see the world around us in a different way. And I think through the project, a big thing that I was constantly sort of thinking about and noticing is that as you're sort of doing the work and forming the connections, and a lot of it was actually developing new artworks, developing programs, developing workshops. So again, many different forms. It's also this perspective that a few people have already articulated, not that you're necessarily I'm not an expert in capitalism. My collaborators, we didn't come to this from that vantage point, but rather that the project gives us kind of a framework to think through it and try to develop more of an understanding as we're sort of educating ourselves. And the one other sort of piece that I would add, because a lot of my current work, I'm based in Vienna. It's 1:30 in the morning, so I'm present, but maybe I won't necessarily be super coherent. But I'm working a lot as an artist. I was trained as a sound artist, and a lot of my background has kind of departed from that perspective. So I've done a number of projects where I actually begin work by collecting and listening. And then all of a sudden I realized that I'm perhaps building an archive, or maybe I'm actually building an audio monument, because I'm suddenly collecting, for example, audio from nuclear survivors that has never really been collected before. And I think that that's this maybe something that we'll talk about later in the panel. But I think one of the things that has really happened in my work is that I've started to think a lot about the different forms that public memory can take, and maybe this idea that sometimes it's an approach of like any form necessary. So similar to Ms. Lois with the Museum of Capitalism, it was like, we actually want to build a real museum in order to help people think through this thing. And if that means that we have to like build a museum, like literally build walls, put work on the walls, build an archive, get people to come in the door, then that's kind of the structure that it takes. And sometimes it might be map making, or it might be recording audio or capturing stories, and you might need to build an archive in order to enact this. So yeah, I've been kind of thinking a lot about how I think form, for me, form is kind of constantly flexing as I'm trying to kind of grapple with these different projects.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Just thinking about the way form responds to the ontology, the system of knowledge, and how it's structured, and what best accommodates that. That's an open question. So you all have provided some really rich directions for us to go in a grand total of like 15 minutes. So we try to curtail some of these. But one thing I heard in a lot of what you all talked about was something that the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talks about the danger of one story, and how one story really can really break the dignity of a people, and or can uplift it at the expense of another. And so there's a real need for pluriversal approach to thinking about storytelling. And so I want to offer that into the conversation to ask the question just related to your sort of regeneration projects. And you can answer this in whichever way you see fit. You know, what stories belong in public? And I ask it that way, and I want to put a finer point on it, but like, whose stories belong in public? That's something that brought us all together as a panel. But you know, I think there's a lot of different ways to approach it, and I'd love to hear from you all's vantage points of your projects, or just your opinions, irrespective of your projects. How do you see stories belonging in public, and whose stories?
You know, it was interesting that when we saw this question, it was like, it's really whose stories or which stories don't belong in public. I mean,
yeah,
it's to me, it's like that's an easier question to get an answer to, because I think everybody has a story, and it depends on who tells the story. The difference is made based on who tells the story and how it gets told. And it can be the very same story sometimes, but it gets told in many, many different ways. I think there should be no limits on whose stories and what stories get told. And I think we have the responsibility of making sure they get told.
I have a follow-up to that, but I want to hear from other people before I respond to that, which it was a good rhetorical response, but there's a really interesting point here. Others want to pop in? Stories belong in public, or what stories belong in public from the perspective of your projects?
I'll just say quickly, I mean, I think one of the things that's really unique about the regeneration projects, and I've had the chance to work with a couple of teams more closely, but also been following the projects through the development, is that there is this kind of focus on like living history, and also things that are happening and kind of unfolding right now, which I think is really unique. When we think about monuments, a lot of times we're sort of thinking about something that kind of like happened in the past, and it's like past and it's gone, and it's sort of quote unquote over, which again, I mean, Museum of Capitalism, right, is really playing with this temporality of like, when is it too soon or too late to memorialize something. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about working with actually unfolding stories is that you have this kind of potential for ongoing dialogue, but you also have this sort of very, very important work of letting people speak for themselves, of letting people that are actually going through something now collect their stories, and many of the projects are actually growing out of the communities themselves. So it's kind of about who's telling whose stories, and sort of like who these stories are collected for. The one other thing that I will add, which I don't know if Paul remembers this, but a long time ago, Paul and I had a conversation about monuments, and he kind of coined this formula that I thought was really brilliant. That in thinking through monuments, you can kind of think about it as math. So let's say that you have a monument. you can add to it, you can subtract to it, or perhaps you can somehow multiply it, right? So if there's like an existing thing that has been commemorated in the world, perhaps there's a story that needs to be told in addition to that. If there's a story that's being told by a particular monument, perhaps it needs to be subtracted and removed, or maybe multiplied in another way. And I think that this kind of connects to what I was thinking about earlier when I saw the question, that a lot of it is not even necessarily about like the stories themselves, but then what the reaction is and the wrapper and the conversation around these stories and the exactly, the ecosystem and kind of who's getting to respond. So
yeah, I'd like to think with that idea a little bit more, because I guess when I see that kind of question, which stories belong in public, and I take words apart and I kind of go, well, what's public? You know, I mean, there are publics, right?
Yeah.
And it also makes me think about space and then what's space, and how do we, who is aware of all kinds of spaces. A lot of times somebody might not think of something as a memorial or a monument or whatever, but it is to other groups. So a lot of stories are actually, you know, a lot of memories are out there, but not everybody is aware of it. They're not the sanctioned official, you know, from the cities putting funds in this or some big institution, blah, blah, blah. But there are people that have shrines in their house, you know, that when accidents happen, people often create memorials or accidents, or just, you know, the police constantly murdering Black people and so forth. And people create a memorial right on the street. And that's not usually counted as, you know, an official kind of monument or something, but those are important kind of memory projects. Article or essay that I really love by Bell Hooks is called In Our Glory. And then it's got a subtitle that I never remember, but it's a really important essay to me, because she's talking about her family and she's thinking about a photograph of her father. And she brings up how people in Black homes, the importance of photography and how people would kind of curate in their home and have their family pictures on the wall. And, you know, a lot of people have family photographs on the wall. She's particularly making a point about Black families and the importance of photography growing up with so much negative imagery constantly, you know, stereotypical kind of things. And the fact that, yeah, a lot of these institutions will exclude or only include people in some kind of very limited and often racist kind of way, whatever. So people have these spaces, and I love it because, and I always tell people that, you know, when I go to talk to classes and they want to talk about curatorial work and we want to think about what public humanities are, I really try to encourage people to think about these other types of projects that are always going on. The fact that in people's family, and it's often, I think it's often women, but it's probably other people too, but there's often somebody who is the family archivist who's got all these, you know, photos and pamphlets. And they have that, and then they pass that on to somebody else, a younger person in the family, and they inherited that work. So there's a lot of types of memory projects that happen that are just not acknowledged. And sometimes, and I feel like those should get more support and stuff, but sometimes it's like, I'm kind of glad that maybe not everybody knows about it, because if some people got their hands on those things, they would ruin it and they would mess it up. So anyway, that's my little 2 cents on that.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that was more than 2 cents. I'm like, thinking about the point you just made there. You know, the families role, the sort of counter archives that people create, counter storytelling. I'm like getting emotional thinking about my father. He was just such a history buff. He did all the sort of ancestry in our family, and he passed away a couple of summers ago. When he passed, my grandmother sent me a bunch of his things. I learned in his passing, not only was he doing that for our family, but he also was a docent for like the first Black founded town in California, and fundraised for them. And there was just all this ephemera about that. And it resonates on in a really personal way, what you bringing that up. But also the sort of shielding, what Fred Moten might call the undercommons that Black people often form to protect those things from being, you know, co-opted, destroyed, all sorts of forms of predatory behavior. So I just, snaps to all of that. Mike, did you have thoughts here on this question of stories in public and which belong? Or
Yeah, well, it's so great to hear from everybody. I think Lois, when you were sort of asking that question of like what stories shouldn't be told in public, I was also thinking about like this quote from Fred Wilson, the artist, who said we included this in the field trip guide for museums because I think it's important to think about like what stories have museums, or the people, museums aren't just these buildings that make decisions, right? Somebody in that building is making a decision, curators, staff, whatever that be, but they're making decisions to decide that certain stories shouldn't be told or don't need to be told in public. And that quote from Fred Wilson is, what they put on view says a lot about a museum, but what they don't put on view says even more. And I love that level of like questioning and interrogating, and hopefully bringing a lot more people that are visiting museums into that sort of mindset of questioning, the stories that museums are choosing to put on view or not put on view.
Yeah, so I love that, and I think that the sort of undercurrent that I'm hearing here is about power. I think, and there's a real I think Ms. Lois, you mentioned this before. You said it depends on who's telling the story, and I think just to put a finer point on that and tie into something that Tanya, you also said, was going into some of the words in this question of like public. I think a lot about publicness, this idea of publicness and how, there's never a single public, just like there should never be a single story. And how when we're talking about which stories belong in public, I think there's a real question in there right in the middle with who are we trying to encourage to belong? And feel belongingness. And belongingness can really be seen as a form of just feeling at home. And really underneath that is the feeling of intimacy. And so I guess when I hear the question of like what stories belong in public, I have a little, I guess, devil's advocate kind of question to ask you all, which is, have you ever encountered spaces, spaces where putting a story out there might endanger that public that you're trying to reach, or it might sort of create a lack of intimacy or lack of trust if that story were placed in that particular space. So I'm asking, have there been an example of something like that that's happened before that sort of showed you the limits of publicness? And I guess part of why I'm bringing this up is there's some, really interesting thoughts around there. I'm not sure if you have heard of that, the book by the sociologist called Cosmopolitan Canopy, where he talks about, sociologist talks about certain public spaces and how they actually encourage a place for everybody, and they're actually very rare. And he was trying to understand why that is. And so in his work, seeing how rare it is, for me, it sort of draws a finer point on this note we're saying together here now, which is that, how can you tell when a story is safe or when a certain public feels safe enough to feel that belongingness? So those are all the thoughts that are swirling around in my head when you all were answering the question the first time. Kind of want to drill down deeper. Are there moments where it's not okay to tell that story, and maybe why?
I'll take a stab at it. I don't know if I have an example of it, but just as in a broad sense, mm-hmm. I think the place where stories are told, depending on whatever demographic that story represents, mm-hmm. it highly depends on the institution, the organization, the person who is in fact telling that story, because some
and benefiting from it potentially.
Yeah, because it could be a totally innocent story and a really wonderful and inspiring story to me. And if you take it to the wrong place and have it butchered, then it's bad. It's not a good thing to happen. So I think part of what I'm feeling strongly about is that there has to be our story, whoever you are, our story has to be a story that's told from our perspective. We have to be there to make sure that story is safe. If we're not there, the risk of it being unsafe just grows. And so I think, and that's what I think typically has happened, historically has happened with the so-called mainstream institutions. They've had the freedom to tell stories of the world, of everybody, of every demographic in the way they want to tell it. And so now we find ourselves much, much later trying to untell those stories or to retell those stories or to fix the mess, if you will. And so I think the danger is in not being there and and having those of us who have maybe a different way of telling the story, not having us present and not acknowledging the value of what we bring to that story.
That's, yeah, right on the money. I think just it increases the risk of telling the story without dignity, you know? Yeah. Absolutely. Any other thoughts about the sort of sense of ownership over storytelling, the sense of public space here that feels okay? If not, I have one last question before we open it up to the attendees. We have about 60 here.
Well, I just wanted to say I really appreciate what you said, Ms. Lois. I mean, it's like that phrase that people say, nothing about us without us. Yeah. That's, you know, to bring it down to a slogan again, but it's something for people to remember, because often there are places that, you know, keep people out of being the ones to shape that story, and you're just supposed to come in there and consume it, but it's your people's story, and you're not there to even kind of shape it, and they don't even understand the history, and there's no relationship between communities a lot of times. So it feels very extractive and very kind of like a colonizing kind of project when institutions, these mainstream or white museums, kind of try to pick up on other people's histories. And it's like, they should just bring in people who are already doing that work.
And then let them do the work. Don't
that part, implementation.
Let them do the work. You know, don't impose all the restrictions that make them behave in the same way you were behaving. And don't do that, because you might as well not even have them there. You know, and I'll say one final thing on that. The other travesty, I think, is for those mainstream institutions who get all of the money, including my tax dollars, not to have my story adequately represented is not the thing to do. You know, I pay the same amount of tax to support that institution as anybody else. Well, not the same amount, because other folks, you know, taxes are
same rate, yeah.
But you understand my point. Why are my stories not told, and why are my people not represented in those institutions where they're trying to tell them? And in most instances, doing it pretty poorly. So
I love this, and I think you know, we've had some folks popping some questions in the chat. I have one sort of big overarching question I want to ask you all, and then and it's really just an opportunity for you all to talk about what you're doing next and what you all have in the works. Ms. Lois, you know, you're part of the Regeneration team with the Black HerStory initiative, which is really exciting. Tanya and Mike, you all collaborated with Monument Lab on the field trip project, which is debuting really soon. Andrea, you know, you're Regeneration advisor, part of the care committee. So, you know, one of the things I want to ask is, what are questions that you all are encountering in the field? What are you all encountering that you are looking for answers from, that you'd like to engage with and share with the community of care that we're building tonight?
Well, somebody else can go first this time.
Yeah. I think maybe I'll do a reverse order. Ms. Lois has been the trooper kicking us off. Andrea, you unmuted yourself. Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I was also totally ready to just listen to Ms. Lois all night. So I mean, actually, the last question is sort of maybe I want to tag on to that, because I've been thinking about this I know a few of the teams from Regeneration are really grappling with this question of again, kind of which stories do you put in public and really when? And I think there's also kind of a related question, which is, how do you ensure that that stories are captured, or that history is sort of recorded, or that a dialogue happens if it's not the right time for it to be shared in public, either because that history is perhaps too triggering or traumatic for the person who's sharing that history, or sort of like history is not quite maybe ready to be in public. And this is something that with a few of the teams, particularly that are working around these participatory methods around oral history interviews, or working with archives, I think it's a really tough question, and actually something that I've faced in a couple of personal projects where there's a really, really acute need to actually do the work. It's kind of like Tanya said, like, I'm just going to have to go there. Like, you actually have to just do the work now, even though you know that it's maybe not the right time for something to become super public, or perhaps you have to build the archive before you're ready for that to then move into another form. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. I'm also doing some work myself outside that's thinking through the relationship between art funding and what work actually gets made. Right. So, of course, with the kind of curatorial and artistic projects that I've been involved in the past, and working with a lot of political art, or a lot of art that maybe is trying to kind of resist systems. And it's probably many artists on the call here that know that a lot of times that's something that many funders are very allergic to and perhaps kind of back away from. So I've been thinking through, and I'm kind of working on a research project that maybe will be a book project that's really thinking through this question of how does funding kind of materially change the work that is being made? And I think that this is a really relevant question also for public history and monuments, right? Yeah. Sort of how does the sort of funding and support structures that sustain or enable the projects that we're making, how does that actually change the work that's getting made, or the stories that are being put out there? And going back to the panelists' comments, right? Like this is it, right? Like which stories get told. Sometimes it's who has the money. So.
Many questions, enough for all of us to sit with. Others, they can be short and sweet if you like, because we have some questions waiting for you and from here, but go ahead.
I like to try to get to this, and also maybe to one of the questions I see about principled struggle, dealing with difficult truth. I think that, this builds with some things that Andrea brought up, that a lot of times, some of us, not everybody, but some people have this kind of, there's a sense of urgency, and also through the arts, where there's like funding and, let's make something, and well, this is happening, so we have to make a thing. We have to make a physical thing to address this issue. So like all this, violence and stuff, sanctioned violence from the state. So let's make a thing and we're going to address it. I was watching, I'm following the case of the Africa family in Philadelphia, and their house was bombed, like in, what was it, 85 or something? Yeah. And they found out more recently that Penn Museum has had the remains of their children. Like it's just a really disgusting story, but also kind of common that museums will have the bodies of like Native American people and Black people and other people. They'll just have the remains. So this, and a lot of times people think of it as, oh, that happened way in the past, but this happened in the 80s, and they just had lied to these people for forever, and they more recently found out. And the family last year had a press conference that they gave, and so it's Penn Museum that has the children's remains. So the family gave a press conference, and the journalist asked them a question about like, so what kind of memorial would you like to have, or something? And like kind of in the I think it was Janet Africa, the mother of one of the children, she said, we're not there yet. You're trying to jump us to another moment. We are not there. This is right now. And so when I think a lot of times about these projects, when she said that really was just like, yeah, because this is what I see. We want to kind of jump to this space And for a lot of people, that's what it feels like. If you're making a thing, it's like that's over, and we're going to sum up this. And it feels a lot of times like people are trying to hush that up and move things along. And really, the memory work is right now. It doesn't happen after things. It happens throughout, like the whole time something is happening. There's no like, oh, memory happens after. It's ongoing. The issue is a lot of times I think the funding requirements need to change so that people could just make spaces for discussion or something. And that's the memorial. The memorial doesn't have to be a physical thing where you have to pressure people to make something. And that's what it often feels like. So I guess that's what I wanted to get at.
That's beautiful. And just a quick response to that, social practice art, I think that's the closest thing I've heard to a or immaterial form of art that gets funded. But yeah, Mike and Lois, and then maybe we'll choose this last question here. But do you have a question that you're asking yourself that you're looking for answers to in your process and your work?
I don't have a specific question, but I'm always questioning, the right time, the timeliness of anything you do, because there's always going to be somebody who disagrees that this is the story to tell or that this is the time to tell. And so we are always trying to be very conscious of our audience, our general audience, but also knowing that there's a risk that whatever you put out there may draw some criticism, and we take them to heart. I think you can't be hampered to tell the story by being afraid that there's going to be some backlash, because there may be. I can think of when we opened an exhibit on Miles Davis, for instance. This has been years ago. And of course, there's some controversy about Miles Davis. Well, we did it, and knowing that might happen. So we got one handwritten letter anonymously, which said, if you really want to talk about the man that he is, you should put a needle in his arm and a whore on the other. And that would be the best description of Miles Davis. Well, that may be a part of that. It is indeed part of his life. But the story we were telling was about his contributions to the world of music, to jazz. And so that we didn't even think that we'd get that response, because that it is not a hidden part of his story that he had some issues with drugs and women. But that wasn't the story we were telling. But we took the risk and told it, because not to downplay those failings, the contributions that he made to jazz and the world of music, just, you can't dismiss. So I think there's always the trying to balance. And I don't know what the answer is, except that you have to be conscious of the fact that there's always the need to try to balance and be in a position to use that as a learning experience for the next time and address it if you have to.
Beautiful. Wisdom. Boom. Mike, do you want to wrap us up with your questions and thoughts?
Well, I can't do better than the conversation that's already happened. I mean, just it's been great to be able to listen to everyone contribute. But just one of the things that's been on my mind, and LaTanya, what you said made me think of it too, is like, and Miss Lois and Andrea and everyone is like, how do we, the institutions or museums or projects that are working with public memory, like how do we hold these institutions accountable? And I think it's been a big question that I know LaTanya and I have talked a lot about, is like, I think there need to be more, communities need to be more active in holding, especially public institutions. I mean, Ms. Lois, you're talking about like, you're a taxpayer. And so you should have a voice in, I think, those institutions that are receiving that benefit. So I think it's this idea of accountability and who holds these institutions and the individuals within them accountable. And how can we all, as, civic communities and residents, just do a better job and play that role better, I think, is a question that I think is just, really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to, answer the question I asked you all, I'm sitting with this, what, you're saying accountability here. I think accountability is a huge part of justice. Seeking justice, commemorative justice, all forms of cultural cultural justice. And I'm thinking about justice as a genre in and of itself. That there's a whole cadre of counter storytelling that has been happening that often doesn't get the support that hopefully with the help of Monument Lab is going to start shifting a lot more. Thank you all so much for being so generous with your time and all kinds of time zones from so many perspectives of your lives, your rich and varied lives. Before we sign off, just wanted to say, please check back in with us for our next Regeneration Roundtable. It's going to be July 5th. If you are subscribed to our newsletter, to the social medias, you will hear all about it. But just put it on your radar now. Save that date, and give a round of virtual applause if you can. I don't know if you can with the virtual capabilities here, but to our amazing panelists, I know I will. Thank you all again for coming and being present with us for this conversation on Reassess and Regeneration. All right. Take care, everyone.